Bob Costas covered Willie Mays. Nobody knows more about Willie Mays and baseball than the great Bob Costas. What'd you think? Willie Mays passing, 93 years old. What were, it's a cliche question, but it's, I think, always the most interesting. What's the first thing that crossed your mind when, you heard the news that Willie Mays passed?
Well, I wasn't surprised, Dan, because I was in touch with people at the Giants. It's been a long time since I last spoke with Willie, probably a couple of years. But I knew that the end was very near. This game they're going to play tomorrow night at Rickwood in Birmingham, Alabama, was in part dedicated to him because he played for the Birmingham Black Barons in that ballpark when he was 17 years old in 1948. And when they said that he couldn't make it to the game, even in a medevac plane, he couldn't have made it to the game, then we knew that the end was near. And he was the oldest living Hall of Famer at 93. Whitey Herzog, who was 92, passed away a couple of months ago. So it's not a surprise, and it's a good long life and a life well lived. But I think it's now almost the consensus. You could say it's tough to compare different eras. You could say that Ted Williams was a greater hitter. You could say that his greatest contemporary, Hank Aaron, was a greater hitter. You could say, if you want to look past the steroids, that Barry Bonds put up post-steroid numbers that were better than Willie Mays. But I think the general consensus is that Willie Mays is the best all-round player who has ever played. And when that discussion is reduced to just baseball, leave the social justice aspects out of it, what you can say about Willie Mays or a healthy Mickey Mantle or Hank Aaron or Ken Griffey Jr. is that they played against integrated competition. Through no fault of their own, Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb didn't. Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell didn't. That's a separate conversation. The conversation should almost divide it from post-Jackie Robinson on or second half of the 20th century on. And if you confine it to that, the greatest player all around of the second half of the 20th century is Willie Mays.
Bob, a couple questions, because you're, I think, the perfect guy to ask. As a kid, you always emulated people, and I loved Billy Williams. I loved Bob Love, the forward. I grew up in Chicago. But we all wanted to make basket catches like Willie Mays. And I asked Johnny Bench about that. I said, well, why? He was great friends with. He said, well, because he tried it, it worked for him, and it was cool. I don't think people understood the flair that Willie Mays had in a bland sort of era. The hat flying off, the basket catch, those kind of things, Bob.
He had style without an ounce of exhibitionism. He had actual style in everything he did. If you went to a game and had never seen a baseball game before and knew nothing about the game, and Willie did nothing special. Let's say he went 0 for 4 that day. There was no chance to make a spectacular play, just the basket catch. The way he carried himself, there was something about him. He was legitimately great, objectively great. But then there was the part that you couldn't really quantify, but you knew it when you saw it and felt it. He just had presence. And he was just so much fun to watch. And he knew it. He often said, you have got to entertain the people. One of my favorite quotes from him was, I can make a hard play look easy, but I'll also make an easy play look hard. You want to see me chase it down in the gap? I could get a better jump and be waiting for it, but I'll chase it down in the gap. I'll make the catch anyway. And he did consciously ask for a cap that was a half size too small. So when they went racing around the bases or racing after a fly ball, it would fly off. And that was distinctive to him.
I swear to God, like he's in New York or San Francisco and I'm in Gary, Indiana, and we're doing that. Like we were doing, we were trying to basket catch. Jerry Morales did it with the Cubs a little bit in left field, but we were doing that. We would knock our hat off because, we weren't smart enough to get too small a hat. Did he have you? I'm sure you were around him a bunch. Was it the same thing in person? Did he have that it factor, that style, that swag in person?
He was a great storyteller. He had a tremendous sense of humor. He knew how to deliver a line. And even in the presence of other all-time great players, they would defer to him. You mentioned Johnny Bench, and I love Johnny. And just as an aside, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but every year at the Hall of Fame. And if you've never been to Cooperstown, it's hard to get there, but it's worth it. And the Otesaga Hotel is right on the lake. And here's what Johnny Bench does. He calls every new Hall of Famer aside, and they sit on the veranda and they look out at the lake. And he says, I just want you to sit here for 5 minutes and think about what this means. And think about the fraternity that you're joining. Nobody has more respect for that than Johnny. And one of the luckiest things in my career, I think it was 2015 in Cincinnati, they named the 4 greatest living players, in effect, a Mount Rushmore. And it was a fan vote. And those 4 players were Johnny Bench, Sandy Koufax, Hank Aaron, and Willie Mays. And I sat down for an interview with the 4 of them. And all I tried to do was, in effect, roll the ball out, if we can mix basketball and baseball metaphors, and let them talk among themselves. And, you know, Sandy is very reticent to do an interview. And when I asked him, he said, I'm only doing it because it's the other guys. And it's a conversation. It's not just about me. And the anecdotes they told and the mutual appreciation. People thought that there was a rivalry, and I guess there was to some extent, between Hank and Willie. But, you know, as people get older and the end is closer than the beginning, they mellow. And I think that they had real fondness, real respect for each other in the second half of their lives.
Who's the best the living ball player right now? Best.
The best living ball player right now. I'm probably overlooking somebody. Shohei Ohtani is making a case. Aaron Judge is making a case, but let's leave out active players. I would say the healthy young Ken Griffey Jr., the pre-steroid Barry Bonds. You can make a very good case for those players. As a hitter, Albert Pujols was a terror in his Cardinal years, not the Angel years, but the Cardinal years. And he was overlooked a little bit outside St. Louis because of the home run exploits of first McGuire, who preceded him in St. Louis, and Sosa, and then Barry Bonds. And we know that that little window in time is separate from everything else. But if you look at Albert Pujols' numbers as a Cardinal, I mean, we're in Ted Williams territory or pretty close to it.
Hey, I want to go back to something you mentioned. Was there a big-time rivalry, jealousy between Aaron and Mays?
I think people played that up more than it really existed. I was lucky enough to do an hour-long sit-down with the two of them on HBO in a theater in front of a very appreciative audience that included other Hall of Fame players. And the conversation between the two of them, it was just like two old-timers sitting on the veranda in Cooperstown at the Otesaga Hotel. And Willie told a great story. He says, they said he had that high-pitched voice. They said I had a problem with Hank. No, I didn't. In fact, if I was in a slump and we played the Braves, I'd ask Hank if I could borrow one of his bats because there were a lot of hits in that bat. And I'd break out of the slump. And Willie was a better storyteller than Hank. And Hank just sat back and laughed. And it was just so much mutual appreciation. And my God, if there is a Mount Rushmore of modern baseball, that's half the 4 heads on it. That's Hank and Willie.
Is there anybody that you saw, and I point to Eric Davis because I remember when Eric Davis came up, everybody compared him to Willie Mays. Is he the closest? Maybe I know he got hurt and all that. But in terms of style, running it down, base running, that whole thing.
I'm glad you mentioned Eric Davis. I loved him, and he had the potential. Boy, he whipped that bat through the hitting zone and on the bases and in the field. And then he had that terrible injury, injured his spleen diving for a ball, as I recall, and it short-circuited his career. But he was on that kind of path. I think the closest comp is the young Ken Griffey Jr. Barry Bonds was a Gold Glove left fielder, but left field is not as important as center field, and Barry did not have a strong arm. Griffey was a spectacular wall-climbing center fielder with a good arm and with all kinds of power. Yes, it was a home run happy era, but he twice, I think, hit more than 50 home runs. And he was, like Willie, so exuberant. I mean, his nickname was the Kid, wore the hat backwards. And it was like he was a kid enjoying baseball. And you could feel that enjoyment. I think given center field, Mike Trout is great in his own way. But given center field, I would say that Griffey is the closest comp.
Bob, how difficult was it for Mays and Aaron coming up in the South playing baseball? You know, Jackie Robinson had broken the color barrier, but how difficult was it? Travel, that kind of thing.
You know, Willie was generally embraced in New York in the 50s. There was a problem in San Francisco. Part of it was just pure racism. He had difficulty buying a house. He was Willie Mays, had difficulty buying a house in a red line neighborhood. But another part of it was that the San Franciscans thought he was a New York guy. And the newcomers, who themselves made the Hall of Fame, Orlando Cepeda, Willie McCovey, they were more San Francisco's guys. But then, of course, Willie Mays just won them over eventually because as great as they were, he was clearly the greatest of the great. Hank's situation was different. In Milwaukee, by Hank's own testimony, he was generally embraced. He goes down to Atlanta in 1966, and a lot of the black ball players, when the team first said they might move south of the Mason-Dixon line, they expressed reservations. Are we going to be able to live where we want to live? What are we going to face here? Now, I don't know how much Hank got from the Atlanta fans, but when he was approaching Babe Ruth, you know, if Hank had just stopped at 600 home runs, maybe he wouldn't have gotten the same hate and resistance. But when he was approaching Babe Ruth, he received thousands of hateful, blatantly bigoted letters, death threats. The FBI had to step in. His kids needed special protection. And then his real triumph, Hank told me and others that his real motivation to pass Ruth wasn't so much statistical, but it was to refute all the haters. And so 715 had an entirely different meaning than when Barry Bonds passed Hank statistically at 756. It was a civil rights triumph. And the way Hank carried himself with the kind of dignity and decency that was really his hallmark as a person, that was significant. So he faced real outward racism, probably more than Willie in generally faced in more cosmopolitan San Francisco. But in the end, they both triumphed. It's just irrefutable how great they were as players, but also how decent and likable they were as people. No fair-minded person can say a negative word about either one of those two great gentlemen and great players.
This is inconceivable to the modern athlete, and me going back, if I'm back in the 80s, this is inconceivable. But correct me if I'm wrong, but Mays lost a couple years like Williams did joining the Army, being a part of the armed forces, the military here in the middle of his baseball career.
Yeah, you read my mind. That was going to be the next point I was going to make. You know, Ted had 2 tours of duty, World War II and Korea. He would have hit well over 600 home runs. But home runs are not really the thing that defined Ted Williams. It's the 344 batting average and all the rest. And the last guy to hit 400 and the home run in his last time at bat. But to your point, it's interesting. Willie missed most of 1952, which would have been his second season, and all of 1953. He winds up with 660 home runs. If you give him 30 in each of those seasons, which is reasonable because when he came back in 54, he made the great catch. And in 55, he hit 51 home runs. Let's say you give him 30. That's reasonable because he was never hurt. He played 150 games every year. So if you give him, do the simple math. I'm not saying he winds up ahead of Aaron, but there's a very good chance that he passes Ruth before Aaron. And then that puts Aaron's record in an entirely different light, even if he goes past him to 755. That would have changed history in the way we view it, but that's the way it went.
You know, I one of the things that pops into my mind, and then it was confirmed, Johnny Bench talking about it. When I just spoke to Johnny Bench, Bob, he must have used the word love of the game 20 times in a 20-minute interview. And he referred to himself, obviously, but mostly to Willie Mays. And, you know, to your point, I can make a hard play easy and easy play hard. That's joy to me. Maybe I have it wrong, but that seems like dudes played with pure joy.
Absolutely. And, you know, in the lead up to this Rickwood game, the MLB Network has been doing a lot of stuff from Birmingham, and there are still quite a few surviving Negro League players who will be there. And some of these guys express themselves this way. They say, yeah, it was wrong that we couldn't play in the big leagues, but I would have played for nothing because I love baseball.
Yeah. I mean, it just, you know how you do an interview with somebody and something comes through, it shines through and it's authentic. And man, that's the deal. When Willie Mays came up, the world is different, right? We know prodigies when they're 12 years old. Was going backwards, did people know this guy? Did people know here's this guy who's going to change baseball, going to be the next big thing? Aaron, Billy Williams, I would put into that one of my heroes. Did people know about these guys coming in?
Well, that predates even my time. Willie's rookie year and Mickey Mantle's rookie year, 1951, is the year before I was born. But from what I've been able to read,
but you're a historian.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time with all of them. I was lucky enough to not just interview, but become friends with Musial and DiMaggio and Williams and Mays and Aaron and Mantle. And now, sadly, they're all gone. I think it was pretty clear from the start. Mantle was the Commerce Comet. He was hitting tape measure home runs, even in spring training in 1951. He was an incredible combination of power and speed before his legs betrayed him. And Willie was this miraculous player. That Terry Cashman song, which is actually entitled Talking Baseball, but everybody thinks the title is Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, because that's the refrain after every stanza of the song. Those three Hall of Fame outfielders for Brooklyn, the Giants, and the Yankees at the same time in the 50s. That was a magical era. Ken Burns' baseball documentary really captures it when he calls the 1950s New York the capital of baseball. And there was a Mays and Mantle discussion that went on until the mid-60s. And younger fans might not really grasp this because Mantle's stats, well, certainly Hall of Fame stats, cumulatively, they don't measure up to Mays and Aaron because they played longer and at a higher level for a long time. But if you take the 10, 12 best years of Mantle's career as an offensive player, then you understand why at the time there was a legitimate Mantle-Mays discussion going on, and they were both so dynamic in different ways. I mean, every time Mantle came to the plate, you thought there might be a 500-foot home run. And he had that same quality in a different way. If you were someone who knew nothing about baseball and you went to Yankee Stadium, your eyes would immediately go to him. If you look at an old black and white film of Don Larsen's Perfect Game, Mickey Mantle looks physically different than everybody else on the field. When people say, could he play today? Damn right he could play today. And so could Willie Mays and so could Hank Aaron, because some players just transcend the era.
Was there a big rivalry between Mays and Mantle?
No, because Mickey was always so gracious. Mickey always said, Willie's the best all-around player. And he always said that Hank was the best hitter. And he always had that kind of wistful regret about what might have been. That was part of Mickey's story, what was and what might have been. And it broke Mickey's heart that he played a little bit too long. And his lifetime batting average after 14 seasons was 309. He played 4 more seasons. And in the last year, it went down 309, 306, 305, 302, and then 298. And, the modern analytics say batting average doesn't matter that much. But in Mickey's time, you wanted to drive in 100 runs, you wanted to hit 30, 40 homers, and for sure you wanted to hit 300. 300 mattered. The difference between 306 and 302 isn't that much. But between 302 and 298 just seems like a different thing. And it bothered him till the day he died.
That's so interesting because I totally get that. It's like, I remember, I forget who the pitcher was telling me, I need to strike out one batter per inning. Like, that's huge to me. I need one strike. If I'm going to pitch 9 innings, I need to have 9 strikeouts. One batter per inning. The reason I asked you about the Mantle thing, because fans didn't really look at it that way. My father liked them both, loved them both, Mantle and Mays.
Yeah.
And I remember being a little kid and guys would be like, well, you can't love them both. And my dad's like, why can't I? They're both great players. What the? No, you got to like Mantle. No, you got to like Mays, right? And it was a big debate back then.
Mickey, they played against each other as rookies in 1951 in the World Series. And here's one of those great baseball ironies. Willie Mays hits a fly ball to right center field in a game at Yankee Stadium. Joe DiMaggio, in his last year, calls Mickey Mantle off. And if Joe D called, you backed off. and Mickey slammed on the brakes, and his cleats hit a drain cover in right center field that ripped his leg up. And that's what started. There was no arthroscopic surgery. That's what started the cascade of injuries. But think about that. The three of them coming together. Mays hit it. DiMaggio caught it. Mantle had a career-altering injury at the same time. And then subsequently, they met in the World Series in 1962. And Mickey liked to tell this story. Neither one of them had a great series. And he's standing out there in center field, and a leather-lunged guy from the bleachers says, Mantle, we came here to see who was worse, you or Mays. You win. Because Mickey was humble. He loved to tell stories on himself.
Yeah, I never understood growing up in Chicago why you couldn't like the White Sox and the Cubs both. Like, I know I'm a Cub fan. I would go to Wrigley 100 times over one. But I'd love to see a Subway Series or an L Series or whatever the hell you call it. I've never understood that.
Well, that's a South Side, North Side thing. That makes more sense than having to pick between Willie and Mickey.
Right, but I mean, my dad was like, "I like them both. Get the hell out of here." Hey, last thing. When you think about that era in baseball, Johnny Bench said this, and you touched on it. He said, "Look, I don't give a damn. I know I could play in this era. I know Mickey could play in this era. I know Mays and Aaron could play in this era." Do you think that era? You mentioned it earlier, and I'm not going to say this. I'm having trouble making my point. Did that era translate? Like, guys hit monstrous 660 home runs in an era where ballparks were big. Could you look at that era and say, what about that era relative to this era? I'm not asking you the right question. I hope you get my point.
No, I get the question you're asking. I think that the post-World War II generation, and factor in my bias, I was a kid, and whatever you fall in love with, sports, music as a kid, is going to resonate with you more as you get older. So factor that in. But you had many of the modern elements of baseball, but baseball still had a hold on the imagination of the American public that it might not now. More romance, maybe more mythology and legend connected to it. But I think this is fair to say that any of the greatest players, I don't know about the average players, but the greatest players would translate. And they'd have all the advantages of training, and to whatever extent analytics and the new information comes into play, and the new surgical techniques, the new nutrition. The off season for the greatest players was, hey, a steak and a baked potato at a banquet. That was pretty much it. That would be different. When somebody says, oh, Babe Ruth, those spindly legs and a big pot belly, which it was toward the end, given the God-given talent, Babe Ruth would not have done some of the things he did unless he was out of his mind if it was, a half century later. And he'd have all the advantages. Ty Cobb, Oscar Charleston from the Negro Leagues, whoever the comp is in the Negro Leagues to the white players, they all would have been great. One of the if it's just a baseball story, we know what the Justice story is. It's unthinkable that in the national pastime, the best players couldn't all play together. It's unthinkable. But if the game was integrated, let's say from 1900 on, as it should have been, and there were still 16 teams, here's what would have happened. Many average black and white players would become bench players. Many bench players, black and white, would be gone to the bushes. And the greatest players would still be great, but they'd be less dominant because the overall quality of play would be better. So yes, Babe Ruth never faced Satchel Paige. But Josh Gibson never faced Lefty Grove and Christy Mathewson and Bob Feller. So we'll never really know.
I knew asking a question vaguely would get a great answer from you. And I think that's why there's Emmys behind you, because, not only are you great, but you saved the interviewer. You just saved my ass there as an interviewer with a great answer.
I'm going to leave you with this. I told my son, Keith, who's down in Birmingham at Rickwood, he's a producer for the Major League Baseball Network. He asked me how many requests I've had after Willie's passing, and I rattled off a few. And he goes, Dan Dakich and you, that's an interesting pairing. And I said, hey, Keith, ever since he acknowledged on the air that I bitch slapped him on his own show, He and I are tight. I'll go on his show anytime.
Yeah. Man, I normally don't accept the bitch slapping. I did for 16 years with Bob Knight. I've kind of put up a wall, but I know when I effed up, and you pointed it out very well, and I appreciate it. I do. What can I tell you? And I'm thrilled that you came on my show. I'm honored.
Anytime, and you think about it, and we're getting older. I'm older than you are, but Bob Knight, Bill Walton, Jerry West, not all that long ago, Hank Aaron, now Willie Mays. It makes you think about your own mortality, especially if your life has been sports.
I don't like it. I just don't like it. I mean, I talk about it. I don't like it. Bob, thank you. And tell your son thank you as well. Appreciate you.
Take care. See you next time.
Hey, thanks for being here. If you're an OutKick fan, we give it to you straight. Here on Don't At Me, we have a ton of fun. More content right here. And while you're at it, sack the hell up and be sure to hit that subscribe button now.